You should be studying more, shouldn't you? The next entrance exam's only a month away, and you act as if you haven't studied at all. If you're not careful, won't Madame throw you out of the house?" Kawase had been studying his nails as he spoke, and his tone suggested that he wasn't holding out too much hope for his advice to be taken seriously. "What? I'm not going to get thrown out." Tamamori shook his head vigorously. "Don't be ridiculous." There was irony in the fact that the part he protested was the belief that he would be thrown out, rather than the part where his lack of studying was highlighted. Of course, that was business as usual for him. The two of them had stopped to eat lunch at Eclair again. Well, Tamamori was eating at least. Kawase hadn't ordered any food, and he seemed content to simply sip on his coffee every so often. But that was like them. They always sat across from each other like this, and they always ordered the same things, and they were always talking about the same things again and again. It was comfortable like that, and they wouldn't want it any other way. But something strange would happen that afternoon that Tamamori would not forget for the rest of his life. Not that he knew it at the time. It was funny how it was always those seemingly average days that hid strange things. And as for strange things, he noticed something quite strange while he was eating. Kawase was leaning with his head against his fist as if he were bored, and he probably was bored if he decided to pick at him about his academic success again. While he was leaning his cheek on his fist, he propped his arm up on the table. He was, of course, wearing his school uniform that he made sure to take immaculate care of. Those black gakuran jackets that Imperial students wore were quite stiff, and they usually didn't move a lot, but Kawase's jacket and white undershirt had started to slide down his wrist, and just at the edge of his sleeve, Tamamori saw something that caught his eye. Tamamori was a curious person by nature, and he would likely open Pandora's box in a heartbeat, if only it were in front of him. When he saw something unusual, he couldn't let it go, and he had to at least point out its existence. Looking closely, what he saw was a rather wide-looking, pink line peeking out from Kawase's sleeve. The pink line was raised slightly, and it was obvious that such a marking was actually a scratch of some kind that had started to heal. Still, it somehow looked agitated, as if it had once been deep and had only just now sewn itself shut. A scratch all by itself was boring news, and it didn't mean anything. But Kawase was someone that took good care of himself. He didn't tend to be clumsy, and he cared a great deal about his appearance, even if he tried to hide the fact that he did. Tamamori had never held back from saying anything to his friends before, and he certainly wasn't going to start now. Innocent curiosity driving him, he gestured at Kawase's wrist with his spoon. "What's that?" "What's what?" "That scratch on your arm. You don't have any cats at Ikeda Manor, do you?" It was only a half-hearted question, and if Kawase had replied with something as simple as, "I nicked myself with my letter opener the other day," Tamamori would have never thought twice about the matter. But instead, Kawase sat bolt upright, jerking his sleeve straight so that it covered up his arm all the way to his hand. He then momentarily held the sleeve in place before carefully lowering his hand to his lap, as if he had to make a conscious effort to force himself to drop them. When he spoke, his voice sounded strained. "It's nothing. It's only something that happened on campus the other day." His face had seemed to drain of all color in an instant, and the eyes that he was looking at Tamamori with were ones of frustration, as if he were angry at him for having the audacity to ask about what had happened. Tamamori glared right back at him. "What's with the tone? Can't I even ask you a question? It's not like you to be clumsy." And that's what Tamamori had presumed it to be at the time, an accident that had been born simply out of a mistake. However, Kawase still wasn't amused, and he curled his lip. "And it's not like you to try and look inside others' clothing. Or maybe it is like you? Pervert." When he said the word pervert, Tamamori rolled his eyes so hard they nearly went into the back of his head. It was a shitty deflection in its truest form. Kawase could say outlandishly mean things when he was angry, and somehow he had gotten angry again. There probably wasn't a human alive that would think looking inside someone's sleeve just far enough to see where the wrist connected to the hand was an act born of perversion. And to even think of it as such was so far-fetched that even Kawase had to know it was ridiculous. The words themselves didn't bother Tamamori, but he was irritated that his attempt to show care for once had been turned into a misdeed. I get it. You don't like to go to the bathhouse, you don't like to be touched by others, and you don't like it when other people look at your skin. You're germophobic to the point where even someone's gaze touching you is gross, right? Tamamori had spat his retort out as a joke to make fun of Kawase's nature, but his words were met with agreement. Well, it would be better if people kept their eyes from wandering. Kawase was nodding earnestly. Tamamori almost balked. Even though he couldn't say this wasn't like him, it was still a gross display of aversion to mankind. You realize how that sounds, right? Tamamori said. Asking that people don't even look at you, that's just pure misanthropy. Kawase could only shrug, seemingly unbothered by how his words made him appear. It's those who stick their nose in other people's business who are wrong, Kawase said. Who's sticking their nose in your business just by looking at you? Tamamori asked incredulously. Kawase didn't answer this and took a sip of his coffee, making a displeased noise when he tasted it. If only other people took care of their hygiene, I wouldn't have to worry half as much. The look Kawase gave him was pointed, and Tamamori took the bait, getting pulled into another fight with him. Although the two of them fought so much that they had grown used to it, and their bickering looked far more like playing than fighting. Tamamori had forgotten about the strange incident until that evening, and really, he had only started thinking about that afternoon again because he was irritated that Kawase's parting words from him had been, "Make sure you study lots so you pass your exam." Just who did that guy think he was? Of course he was studying. Some. He had returned to Madame's house and was sitting inside, close to the hearth. It was bitterly cold outside, and even being next to the fire, he could still feel a chill in his bones. Now she and Madame had not returned home yet, and the only companion he had to complain to was the exact same person he always complained to. Minakami, earlier today I saw Kawase. Tamamori had not said anything unusual in the slightest, and Minakami only hummed in response, not even bothering to lift his eyes up from his book. That Kawase, he's so weird. He has so many strange rules that he makes up for other people to follow. If he has one set of rules this week, he'll have a whole new set of rules next week. He's never happy, and he always has to complain about something. He'll complain about what you're doing, and if he can't find anything to complain about, he'll make something up. One week he doesn't like it when you use his ink to refill your pen, and the next week he doesn't like it if your elbow bumps his elbow while sitting in the theater together. Now he doesn't even like it when you look at him. Earlier he chewed me out just for looking at his wrist. Can you believe that? For looking at his wrist. Isn't that ridiculous? He just got really mad about it. He was finally deigned a response, albeit an unsatisfactory one. Well, that sounds like him, Minakami said. Tamamori didn't agree. Although Kawase could be cruel, most of the time his mannerisms still had sound reasoning behind them, but no matter how he looked at it, he simply couldn't classify today's events as reasonable. Isn't that a bit much even for him? Finally having had enough, Tamamori yanked the book out of his hand and held it up high. It was bad enough to have gotten into it with Kawase, but to be ignored by Minakami on top of everything was unbearable. Don't you think it's strange? Tamamori emphatically drew each word out, expecting agreement. No, rather than saying he was expecting it, it was more like he was begging for it. Minakami looked forlorn at his loss, but he uttered not a single word of complaint, sitting with his now empty hands on his lap. Thinking that if he made Tamamori happy, he might get to return to his book sooner, he decided to capitulate to his desires. Kawase has always been strange, hasn't he? Minakami said, rubbing his jaw as if he was finally thinking about it. I mean, yes, he's completely strange, but not wanting someone to even look at you is a whole new level of rude. I mean, we're friends. It's not like I'm a complete stranger that was staring at him for no good reason, Tamamori said. Minakami paused. He got mad at you for looking at him? So you weren't listening to me. You weren't listening to me at all. Tamamori pointed at Minakami accusatorily. Sorry. Minakami bowed sheepishly in his direction a few times. I was just preoccupied is all. I'm listening now. If Tamamori wasn't so miffed at how he was treated earlier, he probably would have just let the whole matter go at this point. But instead, he re-explained what had happened earlier. And all of that was just because I saw some scratch he had. Minakami's expression changed completely when Tamamori said the word scratch, and he frowned. A scratch? Yeah, that's what got my attention in the first place. I mean, yeah, it's kinda dumb, and I know that one scratch isn't a big deal or anything, but I just thought I'd point it out, you know? I didn't mean anything bad, I really didn't. But he just got so mad at me for trying to ask him.
Next time, he can fall and scrape his whole face up for all I care.
Oh, so he got a scratch from falling? Minakami let out a sigh like he'd been holding his breath, and he seemed relieved for some reason. Tamamori didn't understand why Minakami had seemed so tense, but he knew he'd given the wrong impression. He explained. No, he didn't say what it was from. In fact, I asked him how he got it, and he got even angrier at me. Oh. But isn't that strange? He even tried to hide it, like I care what's on his arm. Oh. Now Minakami had gone completely pallid. He spoke in a voice that was more like a murmur. It sounds like he must have started again. Tamamori was someone that found it hard to pick up on social cues in the first place, and it was impossible for him to understand Minakami's vague words or his change in demeanor. For some reason, he was acting like Kawase getting a scratch on his arm was a big deal, when in reality Kawase had been hurt several times in his life before. It wasn't like he was invulnerable, and he, just like everyone else, had accidents. With that being said, very many of Kawase's wounds happened to be from things that couldn't be called accidents.
During their childhood, Tamamori and Minakami shared more days where they had seen Kawase with bruises on his face than they had days seeing him without bruises.
But the point was there. Kawase had been injured many times before, and it had not elicited such a strange reaction from Minakami. So what was the big deal that now, as an adult, Kawase had some stupid scratch on his arm? Started what again? Rather than immediately answering his question, Minakami instead posed a question of his own. Tamamori, did you happen to notice anything strange about the scratch itself? Maybe something about why he would want to hide it from you? He gave thinking about it a shot. Even with his severely lacking knowledge of medical care, he knew that pink scratches and scars tended to be more recent, while white ones were from longer ago. The scars that Kawase had on his body from his childhood should be mostly white by now. And being that the one from today was pink, he was certain that the one from today must have been somewhat recent. It also looked like it must have once been deep, or Tamamori probably wouldn't have noticed it in the first place. The scratch was raised from what he had seen. Deeper wounds tended to raise slightly when they healed, didn't they? Minakami's pet cat had taught Tamamori this lesson well enough. Now that he thought about it, although it wasn't deep enough to be called something like a laceration, it probably couldn't be called a scratch either. Now that you mention it, maybe instead of saying it was like a scratch, I guess it was more like a cut. It looked like it might have been kind of deep or something at one point. It didn't look like it happened yesterday or anything, but I don't remember it ever being there before. Tamamori paused for a moment, as another thought occurred to him. It kind of looks like it must have hurt. Minakami nodded deeply. I would imagine so. It was seeming more and more like he was missing a piece of the puzzle. Not one that was fond of being left out. Tamamori grew frustrated. Minakami, what are you talking about? Minakami exhaled and smoothed his hakama out, as if he had suddenly become particularly concerned about it. He was silent for so long that Tamamori had almost become convinced that he was going to have to harass an answer out of him, but in the end he spoke of his own volition. Well, I don't know if he's ever told you about this. Minakami paused for a moment, and then shook his head. No, I know he's never told you about this. He wouldn't tell anyone about it. But maybe you noticed it back then. Noticed what? Minakami spoke slowly, picking his words carefully. I first noticed it back in Aizu. It must have been a few years after Kawase's father passed away. I think he was 14 or 15. Anyways, it seemed that Kawase had run out of money again, and my father commented that he looked quite rough. He mustn't have taken a bath in a few days at that point, and it seemed he couldn't take one at his own house for one reason or another. Father invited him to use the wash basin at our house. And he actually accepted? Kawase hated bathing anywhere except his own home, as using the same bathing implements as others tainted his skin. At least, this is the reason Tamamori had come up with in his head. For him to have accepted bathing somewhere unusual, he must have been in dire straits. And he did end up bathing at our house. While he was bathing, Mother told me I should go in and offer him some of my clothes to wear. He would never accept that, Tamamori said. I know, but I still had to go ask because Mother insisted. So I went to go offer him a change of clothes and... Minakami's voice trailed off. The expression on his face was difficult to read. I just walked in. I didn't figure there was anything wrong with it. We had all gone swimming before, hadn't we? It's not like I had the intention to stare, but I didn't have to stare. When I entered, I saw it right away. He had rows of cuts up and down both his arms. All the way up, and then all the way back down. Tamamori could only gape at Minakami stupidly. If he thought Minakami were the kind of person to joke, he would have called him a liar right then and there. Of all the years he had known Kawase, how could it be possible that he had rows and rows of cuts on him after his father had passed away? Minakami continued. They weren't deep enough to be of any real danger to him, but they were still there, and they were so orderly, lined up neatly with even intervals of space between them. That's just like him, I think. Even having just seen it once, I knew it was impossible for it to have been an accident. But if they weren't accidental, just what did that imply? Tamamori couldn't wrap his head around it. Well, wait, he stuttered. But still, Minakami continued. And of course, he was furious that I walked in on him. I knew he wouldn't like me walking in on him anyways, but I really just wanted to put the clothes down and leave. I figured if I did that much, it wouldn't be a problem. But when I saw him, I froze. I don't know how long we stared at each other, but it felt like an eternity. Of course, he got so mad at me that I almost thought he was going to start screaming. I didn't say anything about what I saw. I just bowed my head and left. Part of me considered telling Mother and Father, but I decided against it. Kawase already had a hard enough time with those adults in the village, and I didn't want to make it any worse for him. In the end, I confronted him about it later that day, but he just told me to mind my own business, in his usual fashion, of course. Meaning that he had given Minakami a tongue lashing as a reward for his concern, it seemed. I didn't want to let it go, but I figured there wasn't anything anyone could do for him anyways. He told me clearly enough that he didn't want help, not from me, not from anyone. And he seemed particularly against me telling you about it. There was no way I could tell you without him knowing I went against his word to tell you, and I didn't want to make the situation any worse between us, so I listened. I figured I would just try to quietly watch him from afar, and if he ever seemed like he needed help, I could always try to help him then. Minakami, I don't understand, Tamamori started slowly, stumbling over his own words. How did Kawase get hurt? Minakami lowered his head slightly. Tamamori, you don't actually need me to explain, do you? I know it's probably hard to wrap your head around, but... Minakami was certain that Tamamori already knew what he meant, but he seemed to have closed his heart to the situation in order to save himself from the pain he would feel. It was fairly usual for Tamamori to block out painful memories and emotions, so Minakami was not surprised by this seemingly callous reaction. Seeing that he was still staring at him, he knew Tamamori was waiting for him to say it bluntly. He spoke, his voice soft. He's been cutting himself on purpose, it would seem. I didn't ask him for the gory details, but I would imagine that it's something he's more than capable of doing to himself. Tamamori sat in stunned silence, staring at him like he had grown two heads. Minakami felt terrible for him, and he placed his hand on his head, ruffling his hair gently as if to comfort him. Don't worry so much, Tamamori. To tell you the truth, it seems like in the last year or so Kawase has gotten better. I think that moving to Tokyo really helped him. In fact, maybe that scratch on his wrist isn't self-inflicted. We have no reason to assume it is, simply because it's there. It really could have been from an accident. The only reason I thought that maybe it might have been self-inflicted was because of how you said he reacted when you saw it. And that was true, because if it was just a normal scrape or abrasion, why would Kawase tug at his sleeve to hide it, as if it were something shameful? Why would he get so mad that Tamamori had seen it, going so far as to even hurl an insult like pervert at him? So it's probably not self-inflicted. Tamamori couldn't understand the words that were coming out of his own mouth. But in theory, what if it were? Well, even if it was, Minakami's voice trailed off momentarily and he shook his head as if to clear the bad thoughts. Everyone can falter on the road to recovery, can't they? I'm sure he's still doing better than he was a few years ago. He probably just took one step backwards is all. You don't need to worry, Tamamori. Tamamori shook his head back and forth, an odd look on his face. It seemed like the longer he sat with this revelation, the more he felt the need to reject it. I know that Kawase acted strangely, but it can't possibly be true that he hurt himself. He would hurt others, sure, but hurting himself? On purpose? Tamamori looked at Minakami. Surely we're mistaken about something. Minakami realized then that the place Tamamori wanted to be the most was in denial, and he wasn't the kind of man who would break his delusions. Maybe it was wrong of him to indulge Tamamori in his own delusions, and maybe he really should set him straight on this matter for his own good. But Minakami knew he didn't have it in his heart to convince him that Kawase had been purposefully hurting himself for years. Tamamori already struggled so much in his own way, and Minakami didn't want to be the one to add to it. If Kawase ever wanted to confess his struggle to Tamamori directly, then he could do so himself. Well, it's not impossible that we're mistaken. Who knows? Even that time I walked in on him, I really might have misunderstood what those cuts were from, Minakami said. Right? They could have been from anything, Tamamori nodded eagerly. He went through such a rough time when we were younger. It's hard to say what he really thinks or what his intentions are. I just know that he wasn't pleased to see me, but that might have just been because I walked in on him. That much Tamamori could agree with. Kawase's mind was still a bit twisted from having grown up the way he did. It was almost impossible to tell what he was truly thinking at any given moment. And no matter what, Tamamori couldn't believe the idea that Kawase had been purposefully hurting himself. The two fell into silence once more. Minakami placed a hand on Tamamori's shoulder. I'm sure either way it'll be alright. Kawase really has seemed happier while he's been in Tokyo, hasn't he? Yeah, he has, that's right. He seems to like his classes well enough, and he got lucky enough to be adopted by Ikeda-san, and now they live happily in that manner together. I bet Kawase's actually really happy. He never liked being out in the country. He's always wanted to come here, so now that he's here... It seemed that Tamamori believed Kawase was genuinely happy with where he was at in life, and Minakami certainly wasn't about to suggest any alternative. That's right. It's good that he was able to turn his life around, isn't it? Maybe he just decided to give you a hard time today when the two of you were hanging out, and his reaction earlier was just because he was irascible, like usual. Yeah, that has to be it. Minakami could only silently apologize to Kawase in his heart. He didn't want Kawase to hurt himself, but he also didn't want Tamamori to get tangled up in anything that would be over his head. Tamamori didn't say anything further on the subject of Kawase. To Minakami, it seemed that the shock had been too great, and he didn't know how to process it. He spent the rest of the evening watching after Tamamori, but in the end, he just seemed to forcibly push this new information out of his mind. Honestly, it was probably for the better. Minakami remembered how Kawase had treated Tamamori in the past. That whole incident had been how Minakami had lost the power of the Hashihime in the first place. If Kawase hadn't tried to murder Tamamori for helping him before, Minakami wouldn't be in this mess where he fretted constantly. What if Tamamori fell into a puddle? What if he never saw him again? That was Kawase's fault, even if he didn't know it. So from Minakami's perspective, even if his heart ached for Kawase's situation, he really didn't want Tamamori to get involved. Kawase's true intentions were hard to glean even for someone that could read social cues, and that made him somewhat dangerous. For Minakami, protecting Tamamori always came first. But Minakami knew Tamamori would be heartbroken if something happened to Kawase. A guy like him probably had a plethora of dark thoughts swirling around in his head, and having plenty of dark thoughts of his own, Minakami could easily guess just what ideations he played around with on occasion. It would be a Herculean effort to console Tamamori if he lost Kawase, especially after what he had seen happen to Kawase in their childhood. At least, Minakami thought Tamamori wouldn't take it well. So in some way, he felt responsible for watching after the two of them. Watching after one of them was already a full-time job, but watching after Tamamori and Kawase was a deity-given trial meant to earn him merits for his next life. Surely it was, wasn't it? But for now, his hands were tied. It would be hard to confront Kawase about this directly. He would be more than just difficult to deal with if he felt cornered. Minakami would just have to try to keep an eye on things. The only thing he could do now was pray that Kawase would be able to find peace in his heart, and soon. Tamamori watched as Kawase paced around his room in the Oizumi residence, crumpling his manuscript paper and tossing it behind his head once he finished a page. It seemed that his story about a macaque who sat in a hot spring for so long that it lost its fur and became human was decidedly not going to be the next big hit in literature. As Tamamori watched Kawase, he was lightly rubbing his own chest as if to undo the knot of unease that had built up there. Ordinarily, he wouldn't be so anxious while Kawase was reading one of his own manuscripts. After all, he already knew from the mistreatment of the paper itself that the incoming review was not going to be one of praise. But if he was being honest, something else was bothering him. No matter how many times he tried to put it out of his head, the events that had transpired at Eclair 2 days ago, followed by Minakami's words, had unnerved him, and he couldn't forget the strange things that he had seen. His manuscript this time was a bust, it would seem. As Kawase crumpled the last page, he launched it particularly far behind him. He sighed, and reaching for his pocket, he deftly produced a cigarette to place between his lips. Once the cigarette was lit, he crossed his arms moodily. Firstly, I want you to know that most primates have hair, not fur. And macaques in particular have a mixture of hair and fur. Unable to stand criticism when he was already upset, Tamamori stood up from where he was sitting on the tatami. Oh, forget it already. I don't care about the monkey story. I knew you wouldn't understand it anyways. As Tamamori was taking strides towards him, Kawase puffed a cloud of smoke in his direction in irritation. Then why the hell did you waste my time and make me read that tripe if you're not even going to listen to what I have to say on it? Let me ask you something. Tamamori placed his hands on either side of Kawase on the Fusuma closet door behind him. But Kawase was not fond of this position in the slightest, and he grimaced, drawing his arms into himself. Even though Tamamori had moved towards him with such purpose, now that he was here he realized that he had no clue how to ask what he wanted to ask. Kawase seemed further irritated by his silence. Are you waiting for me to give you permission to speak? Because if so, I'm not giving it. Kawase, you wouldn't ever hurt yourself on purpose, would you? In the end, Tamamori had blurted out the words that had been on his tongue, although it had only been half intentional. Now that he had spoken, he regretted it. But it was too late to swallow those words back down his throat. Once Kawase heard what Tamamori had said, he blanched a ghostly white, but only for a second. In the second afterwards, he was sneering. Of course I wouldn't do something like that. Are you stupid? He gave him a nasty smile, showing every single one of his pearly white teeth. It was such a reassuring answer that Tamamori couldn't help but sigh in relief, drooping his arms back down to his side. Look, I never thought that you would do something like that either. It's just that You what? It was as if Kawase were challenging him, daring him to bring it up. His entire stance was unusually threatening, like he was ready to use any means necessary to defend himself. Even though Tamamori wasn't scared of Kawase, he didn't feel like picking a fight. He had only asked such a stupid question because he had been worried about Kawase, and at the end of the day, it really was a stupid question. And the expression on his face said it all. And really, Tamamori was grateful his stupid question had been shot down with such vigor. After all, what would he have done if Kawase had said yes? Never mind, I believe you. Tamamori flicked his sleeve once in irritation, before trying to match Kawase's pose and glare back at him. I was just curious, that's all. Curiosity killed the cat. Well, I'm not a cat. Good. Then you shouldn't die, at least. Kawase paused, relaxing his stance. He looked at Tamamori from the corner of his eye. But you should be careful about where you stick your nose. Some people would get angry with you for trying to get involved in their business. He stepped forward towards Tamamori, his hand stretched out almost as if he were going to grab him. Seeing his bony hand reaching towards him, Tamamori instinctively stepped backwards, and in the next moment, the back of his head met the bookshelf behind him. There was a comically loud thunk, and in the next few seconds the pain began to roll in. Ah! Ow! He could only groan, and Kawase could only laugh. It was a clear and cheerful kind of laughter, one that didn't seem to fit its Schadenfreude origins. Kawase had always been like this, and even now Tamamori couldn't understand it. Kawase always wore the purest look of happiness on his face when someone was in pain. It really seemed like he was a sadist through and through, someone that liked pain for the simple existence of pain itself. Tamamori had already decided long ago that this guy had a twisted and demented heart, but every time he made Kawase laugh like this, he was reminded. If only his happy face wasn't so attractive, and the sound of his laughter so alluring. It was a dangerous combination, a match made in hell. See what I mean? Kawase said. Curiosity killed the cat. Shut up. Even though they were back to bickering the next moment, Tamamori felt nothing but relief. Yeah, Kawase was okay. He had to be. That oh-so-familiar grin on his face proved it.